What were your parents totally wrong about? My parents banned all music from our house when my little brother was diagnosed as autistic at age 3. They'd read some article about how modern music overstimulates developing brains and decided silence would help him regulate better. They said that if I kept listening to music, I'd become autistic too. Every speaker, radio, and instrument got removed from our house. They installed soundproofing on the walls and made us wear noise-canceling headphones in the car. If I got caught humming or tapping a rhythm, I'd lose screen privileges for a week. My brother had constant meltdowns. He would rock for hours, hitting his head against walls until his forehead bruised purple and green, screaming at frequencies that made my ears ring for hours afterward. I watched him bite his own arms when overwhelmed, leaving deep teeth marks my parents covered with long sleeves even in July. They tried everything they could think of, including weighted blankets that cost hundreds of dollars, special diets where we only ate white foods, essential oils that made our house smell like a health store, and behavioral therapy that cost thousands and required driving 3 hours each way. Nothing seemed to make any difference, and some things made him worse. I loved my brother, but living with him could feel suffocating. And there were so few ways I was allowed to enjoy myself out of the house, because everything could expose me to music. I couldn't join choir even though I had a decent voice, couldn't go to dances where everyone else was making memories, couldn't study with friends because they always had Spotify playing in the background. I wasn't allowed to shop in stores without noise-canceling headphones in case they were playing music. I even had to watch TV on mute and just watch with subtitles because there could be music in the background. Freshman year, I forged my parents' signature to take piano instead of art class, my hand shaking as I turned in the form. The music teacher was this older woman who didn't ask questions when I begged her to never contact my parents about anything. For 45 minutes every school day, I finally experienced what I'd been missing my entire life. Learning to read notes and create actual melodies felt like discovering I could breathe underwater after years of holding my breath. My fingers would shake for the first 10 minutes of each class from the pure adrenaline of doing something so forbidden. One Saturday, my parents went to another autism conference 2 hours away, leaving me to watch my brother. He'd been escalating all morning, that familiar tension building in his shoulders. Around 2 in the afternoon, he lost it completely. This wasn't a normal meltdown. He grabbed a kitchen knife and started stabbing the walls, then turned it toward his stomach. I tackled him and we fought on the floor while he screamed. I got the knife, but he ran to the bathroom and started banging his head on the sink so hard I heard something crack. Blood was running down his face and he kept going harder like he was trying to break through his skull. I begged him to calm down, telling him I loved him and I didn't want him to hurt himself, but it didn't work. I couldn't restrain him and my parents were too far away. Without thinking, I started humming Für Elise from piano class. His body went completely rigid like I'd hit a pause button on his entire nervous system. For the first time in years, he stopped moving and just stood there listening. I kept humming, terrified that if I stopped for even a second, he'd start hurting himself again. My throat was getting dry, but I couldn't risk pausing. He sat down on the bathroom floor and began rocking in time with my humming instead of violently slamming his body around. I sang to him for 3 hours straight until my parents came home, tears streaming down my face as I watched my brother finally, impossibly calm. He even started humming along in perfect pitch, which I didn't know he could do. My parents found us on the bathroom floor. When I explained what happened and showed them the knife marks, my mom collapsed, sobbing. The emergency room doctor said my brother had a severe concussion and needed 17 stitches, but I'd probably prevented fatal damage to his temporal artery. Music therapy is actually highly recommended for autism, she said, looking at my parents with barely concealed judgment. It helps with emotional regulation and communication. You should have been using it for years. The next week, my parents bought a piano, guitars, and drums. They enrolled my brother in music therapy where he thrived immediately, going from daily meltdowns to maybe one a week. The therapist taught him simple rhythms that helped him communicate when words couldn't. They signed me up for piano lessons and cried when they heard me play, apologizing for stealing music from my life. For a brief, beautiful moment, I thought we'd finally found balance and my brother could have the stable routine he desperately needed. Then Friday night, my dad called a family meeting with this manic grin that made my stomach drop immediately because I recognized that look from when he'd announced other life-changing decisions. We've been thinking about how music helped both of you, and we were so wrong to keep it from you, so we're dedicating our entire lives to music now. I quit my job yesterday, and your mom withdrew you both from school because we're starting a family band and going on tour next month. I stared at them in horror, and my brother started rocking harder than he had in weeks, his hands flying to cover his ears as he realized his brand new safe routine was about to be destroyed. My brother's rocking got faster, and his breathing turned ragged like it did before his worst meltdowns. I grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the hallway, while mom and dad kept talking about tour dates and venue sizes. He let me guide him to his room where I shut the door and started humming the same melody that worked before. His hands stayed pressed against his ears, but his body slowly stopped shaking as I kept the tune going. I grabbed his weighted blanket from the closet and wrapped it around his shoulders, still humming while he curled into a ball on his bed. After 20 minutes, his breathing slowed down, and he started humming along with me in that perfect pitch he'd discovered. I stayed with him another half hour until his eyes got heavy and he fell asleep clutching his favorite stuffed dinosaur. Back in the kitchen, mom stood alone washing dishes that were already clean, her hands moving in circles over the same plate. I asked her if she really thought this was a good idea, and she kept scrubbing harder without looking at me. She said dad already gave his notice at work yesterday and filed the paperwork to withdraw us from the school this morning. Her voice cracked when she mentioned the withdrawal forms, but she kept washing that same plate like it mattered. I tried explaining how my brother needed his routine and his therapy sessions and the classroom aide who understood his signals. Dad walked in carrying a stack of printed tour schedules and waved his hand at me like I was being dramatic. He said we'd homeschool on the road and that traveling would be educational and good for both of us. I pointed out that my brother couldn't handle the grocery store without headphones, but dad just kept shuffling his papers and talking about exposure therapy. The next morning, while they spread maps across the dining table marking potential venues with red circles, I texted my music teacher from the bathroom. She responded within minutes saying I should talk to the school counselor confidentially about my concerns. She promised to put in a word for me and said the counselor had helped other students in difficult family situations. That night, my brother rocked in his bed for 3 hours straight while I sat beside him humming every song I knew. I pulled pulled out an old notebook and started writing down everything that was happening with dates and times. I documented how many times he covered his ears during dinner and counted the bruises forming on his forehead from hitting it against his pillow. My hand cramped from writing, but I needed evidence that this plan was already hurting him. Saturday morning, Dad created color-coded spreadsheets of venues sorted by distance and capacity, while Mom set up social media accounts. She made a Facebook page called The Musical Family Journey and uploaded old photos of us looking happy. Dad designed t-shirts with our faces arranged like a band photo, even though we'd never played together. The walls felt like they were closing in as I watched this terrible idea gain momentum online. Sunday, I locked myself in the bathroom with my phone and searched homeschool requirements for our state. The screen showed pages of regulations about approved curricula and mandatory testing and documentation requirements. I printed everything at the library, my hands shaking as I collected the papers about educational neglect laws. The stack felt heavy in my backpack like evidence of a crime that hadn't happened yet. Monday at lunch, I found the counselor's office and knocked until she opened the door looking concerned. I explained everything as fast as I could while she took notes on a yellow legal pad. She asked specific questions about my brother's medical needs and therapy schedule and how long my parents had been planning this. When I mentioned the knife incident and the emergency room visit, she stopped writing and looked directly at me. She said she'd need to follow certain protocols but would try to help us stay safe and stable. She explained that she'd document our conversation and check in with me regularly throughout the week. If things escalated or if we were pulled from the school immediately, she might need to file a report with Child Protective Services. There's something deeply troubling about how these parents swing from one extreme to another. Complete silence to suddenly quitting jobs and planning tours. The timing of this family meeting right when the brother was finally finding peace through music therapy makes me wonder what's. She wrote her direct phone number on a sticky note and pressed it into my hand firmly. She told me to call if my brother got hurt or if my parents tried to leave town before the school year ended. That evening after dinner, I helped Mom clear the table and noticed Dad's laptop open to their credit card account. The screen showed thousands of dollars in new charges for guitars and amplifiers and microphones and mixing boards. A van rental deposit of $2,000 appeared next to purchases from 3 different music stores. Mom's face went white when she saw the total, but she didn't say anything to Dad about it. She opened their savings account on her phone, and I saw her shoulders drop when the balance appeared. Dad kept talking about investing in our future, while Mom stared at numbers that kept getting smaller. My brother sat in the corner covering his ears and rocking, while our parents' new dream destroyed everything stable in his world. Dad dragged amplifiers into the living room the next morning and cranked them up so loud the windows rattled. My brother immediately started slamming his head against the wall, the thuds mixing with the feedback screech from the speakers. I grabbed him from behind and started tapping rhythm patterns on his back, the same ones his therapist taught us, while Dad kept adjusting knobs and saying this proved music was helping him express himself. Blood was already trickling from my brother's forehead, but Dad didn't even notice, too busy plugging in more equipment. I had to physically pull my brother to his room and sit with him for 2 hours doing the tapping patterns until his breathing slowed down. 3 days later at his regular therapy appointment, the therapist's face went pale when she saw the new bruises on his forehead. She asked my parents about any recent changes, and when Dad explained our family band plan, her pen stopped moving on her clipboard. She talked about how routine disruption could cause severe regression in autistic children and how overstimulation from travel and performances could trigger dangerous behaviors. My parents nodded and thanked her, but I saw Dad's eyes glaze over the way they did when he'd already decided someone was wrong. That night, Dad set up his phone on a tripod and recorded himself talking about our journey from banning music to embracing it completely. He uploaded it to every social media platform with hashtags about autism and healing, and within hours we had hundreds of comments calling us inspiring. People were sharing our story and tagging their friends, and suddenly we had followers watching everything we did. Dad kept refreshing the view count and showing Mom how many people supported us. By the end of week 2, Dad had already promised the church we'd perform at their picnic in 2 weeks. He printed flyers with our faces on them and passed them out at the grocery store. My stomach felt like it was full of rocks knowing my brother couldn't even handle the vacuum cleaner without covering his ears. The community center had an autism support group that met on Tuesdays, so I told Mom I needed to go to the library for a school project. I sat in the back and listened to parents talk about their kids ending up in psychiatric hospitals after major routine changes. One mom said her son started biting chunks out of his own arms when they moved houses. Another dad talked about his daughter breaking her own fingers during a meltdown after they changed her school. Every story made my hands shake harder because they were describing exactly what was starting to happen to my brother. When I got home, Mom was sitting at the kitchen table with bills spread everywhere, and Dad was out buying a drum kit. She pulled me aside and whispered that we couldn't afford any of this, that Dad had already spent their entire emergency fund. For a second, I thought she might actually stop him, but then she said we just had to trust his vision and find a way to make it work. She started talking about maybe selling the car or taking out a loan. I found Dad's laptop open on the couch and saw he'd created a GoFundMe page with our whole story, including photos of my brother having meltdowns and details about his diagnosis. He'd written about how doctors said he'd never communicate, but now he was going to be in a band. Complete strangers were donating money and commenting about how brave we were. I felt sick seeing my brother's medical information shared with thousands of people. When Dad came home, I tried to tell him this was wrong, but he just said I didn't understand marketing. A week later, an official envelope arrived from the school district saying we had 30 days to provide proof of homeschool enrollment or they'd pursue legal action for truancy. Mom's hands shook as she read it, but Dad just grabbed it and shoved it in the junk drawer saying he'd handle it later. He never did. The next morning, my phone rang during Dad's rehearsal session, and it was my old school counselor. She said she'd filed a concern report after the truancy notice because she was worried about us. She explained that a caseworker would probably visit soon and told me to document everything that was happening. She said to write down dates and times and take photos if I could do it safely. She told me to be honest about my concerns, but not to make my parents defensive because that could make things worse. 2 days later, someone knocked on our door while Dad was teaching my brother power chords. A woman in a blazer introduced herself as a caseworker from CPS and said she needed to check on our living situation. My parents turned white but let her in, Mom rushing to turn off the amplifiers while Dad started explaining our musical journey. While they showed her her around the house, pointing out all the instruments like they were proof of good parenting. I slipped her a folded note I'd written the night before. My hands were shaking, so bad I could barely hold the paper. The note explained how my brother was hitting his head more every day, how he'd stopped eating anything except crackers, how he hadn't slept through the night since Dad announced the tour. I wrote about the knife incident and the blood and how scared I was that something worse would happen. The caseworker read it while my parents were in the other room and slipped it into her folder without changing her expression. She called my parents back into the room and pulled out a thick packet of forms. Her pen clicked as she started going through requirements one by one. Dad's foot was tapping under the table so hard the whole floor vibrated. She explained that homeschooling meant submitting lesson plans every month and keeping attendance records. My brother had to continue his therapy schedule no matter what. She set a deadline of 2 weeks to provide all the documentation. Dad nodded and smiled and promised we'd have the best education anyone had ever seen on the road. His eyes had that wild look that meant he wasn't really listening. The caseworker's mouth got tight when he mentioned touring, but she just wrote more notes. 2 days later, Dad came home with a van that looked like it had been in 3 accidents. The front bumper was held on with duct tape and wire. One headlight pointed at the sky instead of the road. The brakes made a grinding sound that hurt my teeth. He'd spent our entire emergency fund on it, the money Mom had been hiding for years. I took pictures of every broken part and texted them to my school counselor. The van didn't have proper seatbelts in the back, just some rope Dad tied to metal loops. My brother's car seat didn't fit right and wobbled when the van moved. I documented everything in a notebook I kept hidden under my mattress. The next morning, a letter arrived from my brother's music therapist. She'd typed 3 pages explaining why travel would hurt his progress. She listed all his sensory needs and how performing would overwhelm him. Dad's face got red as he read it out loud at breakfast. He crumpled it up and threw it in the trash. He called her office and yelled that she was trying to hold us back from our dreams. We weren't going back to her sessions anymore, he said. My brother had been making so much progress with her. She was the only person who understood how to help him communicate through rhythm. Now that was gone too. Dad decided we needed practice performing, so he signed us up for open mic night at a coffee shop downtown. My brother started rocking the second we walked in. The lights were too bright and the espresso machine kept hissing. People were talking and laughing and clinking cups. Dad pushed us toward the small stage anyway. My brother froze completely when we got up there. His whole body went rigid and his eyes rolled back. I had to carry him out while he was shaking. His fingernails dug into my arms so hard they left marks. Dad followed us outside and said it went great. He just needed more exposure. The next day, our neighbor knocked on the door at 10 in the morning. She'd been patient for weeks, but the music at 2 in the morning had to stop. Her baby couldn't sleep and her husband worked early shifts. She said if it continued, she'd call the police. Dad smiled and apologized, but I saw his jaw clench. That night, he turned the speakers up louder than ever. The bass shook picture frames off the walls. My brother covered his ears and screamed, but Dad just played over him. Mom was sorting mail in the kitchen when she found the mortgage notice. Her hands shook as she opened it. We were 3 months behind on payments. The bank was starting foreclosure proceedings. She sat on the floor and cried while Dad stood over her. He said the tour would make us rich, even though we didn't have a single booking. He'd been telling people we were already successful musicians. I made a list of safety requirements and brought it to dinner. My brother needed noise-canceling headphones for travel. We could only drive 2 hours at a time before breaks. Why does Mom keep finding these awful financial surprises but never actually do anything about them? The way she discovers the mortgage notice and just cries while Dad stands there makes me wonder what's really keeping her from taking action right now. He had to keep his therapy appointments. Dad looked at the list and laughed. He said, sure, whatever, we'd do all that. But I knew he was lying. His promises meant nothing anymore. I went to the legal aid clinic at the community center the next week. The lawyer was young and tired looking. She explained that courts rarely removed kids unless there was immediate danger. Educational neglect was hard to prove. She helped me understand what evidence I needed to build a stronger case. I had to document everything with dates and photos. She gave me forms for emancipation, but said judges almost never approved them. During rehearsals, my brother started using the rhythm cards his therapist had taught him. He'd tap twice for tired and 3 times for too loud. This was huge because he'd never been able to tell us his needs before. I filmed him using the cards so I'd have proof he could communicate. Dad ignored the tapping and kept playing louder, but I saw Mom watching and understanding. At dinner, Dad read from his laptop about unschooling families. These people online said traditional education ruined creativity. Kids learned better through life experiences than sitting in classrooms. He quoted their posts about how genius comes from freedom. Mom nodded along, but her eyes were empty. I recorded him reading these articles on my phone. The echo chamber was making him more extreme every day. Each new post convinced him we were pioneers of education. He printed articles and taped them to the refrigerator. The people online told him he was brave for breaking free from society's rules. I spent the next morning at the library printing out research papers about autism and routine changes while Dad was at another rehearsal with my brother. The studies all said the same thing about how disrupting established routines could cause major regression and increase self-harm behaviors in autistic kids. I highlighted the important parts with a yellow marker and left the stack on the kitchen counter where Dad would see them when he got home. He found them while making lunch, and his face turned red as he read through the first page. "You're trying to sabotage our family's happiness," he said, tearing the papers in half. "You're just jealous of the attention your brother gets now that he's the star." He threw the pieces in the trash and made me sit through another lecture about supporting family dreams. 3 days later, during an especially loud rehearsal in the garage, my brother started hitting his head against the drum kit over and over. Dad kept playing guitar like nothing was happening until my brother grabbed a broken drumstick and sliced his palm open on the sharp edge. Blood dripped onto the garage floor, and my brother just stared at it like he didn't understand what happened. I wrapped his hand in a dish towel while Mom drove us to urgent care. The doctor needed 12 stitches to close the cut, and she kept looking at my parents with this expression I recognized from other mandatory reporters. "This level of overstimulation is dangerous for a child with his sensory issues," she said while wrapping his hand. Dad told her she didn't understand our family's musical journey and how music was actually helping him. She made notes on her clipboard and said someone would be following up with us soon. The CPS caseworker showed up 2 days later with new requirements, including keeping rehearsals under 70 decibels and mandatory weekly check-ins. She measured the sound levels in our garage with some device and said we were way over the safe limit for any child, especially one with autism. Her increased increased concern made me feel like someone was finally paying attention, but also scared about what might happen next. Dad started researching states with more relaxed homeschool laws on his laptop that night, reading out loud about places where the government couldn't interfere with parental rights. Mom watched from the doorway, twisting her wedding ring around her finger the way she did when she was nervous. I texted my school counselor about Dad's plans, and she told me CPS cases could follow families across state lines. I shared this information with Mom when Dad went to bed, and she just nodded without saying anything. The next afternoon, while my parents were at the music store buying more equipment, I packed emergency bags for me and my brother. I put in 3 changes of clothes each, his favorite weighted blanket, his noise-canceling headphones, all his medications with the prescription labels, and some granola bars. I hid the bags in the back of my closet behind old Halloween costumes. My music teacher called me that evening and gave me the number for a local youth shelter, telling me to save it in my phone under a different name just in case. My best friend's parents reached out through text after seeing Dad's posts about our family band on social media. They offered their couch if I ever needed somewhere safe to stay. Having this small network of people who understood made me feel less alone, even though I knew I couldn't leave my brother behind no matter what. Dad came home the next week with printed confirmation emails showing he'd booked our first show at a music festival 3 hours away in 2 weeks. He taped the confirmation to the refrigerator and circled the date with red marker. "This is when our new life really begins," he said. I could see my brother starting to rock harder in his chair as Dad explained how we'd drive there in the van he was renting. Every day that passed, my brother's anxiety got worse as he sensed the approaching change to his routine. He started refusing to eat anything except white rice and spent hours arranging his toys in perfect lines, only to knock them down and start over. Dad scheduled extra rehearsals over my brother's therapy appointments, and we missed 2 in a row. The therapy center called to warn us that missing 1 more appointment would mean discharge from their program. Losing his weekly sessions with a therapist who actually understood him and knew how to calm him down felt like watching someone cut a rope while we were drowning. My brother had started looking forward to those appointments as the one stable thing in his week, and now even that was being taken away. Late one night after Dad fell asleep on the couch surrounded by booking websites, Mom came to my room carrying a folder. She handed me copies of the van rental agreement, our bank statements showing Dad had withdrawn most of our savings, and printed emails between Dad and various venues. She didn't say anything, but her eyes told me everything I needed to know about why she wanted me to have evidence. Her hands shook as she gave me the papers, and I hid them with the emergency bags in my closet. The counselor texted me the next morning saying she'd coordinated with CPS to do a compliance check on the exact day Dad planned for us to leave. She said she'd done everything she could within the system, and included the direct number for emergency services if immediate danger came up before then. The night before we were supposed to leave, I waited until everyone was asleep, and then snuck into my brother's room with my phone. He was sitting on his bed, arranging his rhythm cards in neat rows, like he did when he couldn't sleep. I started recording while he picked up the cards one by one, tapping each one 3 times before setting it down. First, he grabbed the card with the house symbol and held it against his chest, then the one that meant stay, which he pressed to his forehead. He kept cycling through the same pattern for 20 minutes straight, house then stay, then no, then the card with the van crossed out in red marker. His hands moved faster each time through the sequence, until he was practically slapping them down on his blanket. I kept the camera steady, even when he started rocking harder, and making those low humming sounds that meant he was really upset. After I had enough footage, I uploaded everything to 3 different cloud accounts, and emailed copies to the counselor's secure address she'd given me. Dad spent that whole night posting in his music therapy Facebook groups about our upcoming adventure, and hundreds of comments poured in from parents saying we were brave pioneers breaking free from society's chains. Some woman in Ohio wrote that she was pulling her kids out of school too, because we'd inspired her to reject conventional limits. A dad from Texas said he was buying a van next week to follow our example. The comments made Dad pace around the living room reading them out loud to Mom, his voice getting louder with each supportive message. I watched from the hallway as he responded to every single comment, promising to document our journey and share daily updates about how music was transforming our family. The more strangers cheered him on, the more my stomach twisted, knowing they had no idea what was really happening in our house. The next morning, Dad started loading the van at 5 a.m., cramming in instruments and camping gear, while my brother sat in the corner of the garage, hitting his head rhythmically against the wall. I finally walked up to Dad as he was trying to fit the keyboard into an already packed space and told him I wasn't getting in that van. My voice shook, but I kept talking, saying I'd call CPS myself if he tried to force us to leave. He dropped the keyboard, which made a horrible crashing sound, and grabbed my shoulders hard enough to leave marks. "If you don't come, I'm taking your brother anyway," he said, his breath hot on my face. "You really want to abandon him?" I stared at him, knowing he'd calculated this perfectly, because he understood I'd never let my brother go alone with him. Right at 8 a.m., just as Dad was trying to wrestle my brother toward the van, a white sedan pulled up, followed by another official-looking car. The CPS caseworker stepped out with a supervisor holding a clipboard, and Dad's face went from red to white in seconds. Looking at these rhythm cards my brother's using to say house and stay makes me wonder if Mom's been quietly teaching him ways to speak up when Dad won't listen. He started yelling about freedom and parental rights while neighbors came out to watch from their driveways. The supervisor calmly asked to see our living situation, while Dad blocked the doorway, insisting they needed a warrant. I stepped around him and handed the caseworker my folder with everything, including the rhythm card videos on a USB drive, the photos of my brother's injuries from his meltdowns, and records showing all the therapy appointments we'd missed during Dad's music obsession phase. Mom suddenly appeared behind Dad, and her voice cracked as she told the supervisor she was worried about safety and stability for her children. Dad spun around staring at her like she'd stabbed him in the back. The supervisor reviewed the materials right there on our front porch, while my brother rocked in the corner humming the melody I'd taught him months ago. After 20 minutes of reviewing documents and making phone calls, the supervisor issued an immediate safety plan that blocked any travel, required us to resume therapy within 72 hours, and mandated supervised compliance checks. Dad's hands shook as he signed the papers. Then he stormed off to the van and revved the engine so loud that car alarms went off down the street. He peeled out of the driveway alone, leaving skid marks on the concrete while we stood there in sudden silence after weeks of his constant noise and chaos. Mom discussed discovered that night that he'd emptied our savings account and maxed out 2 credit cards buying music equipment, leaving us with $17 in checking and a stack of overdue bills. She sat at the kitchen table with papers spread everywhere, using her phone calculator over and over like the numbers might change if she tried again. I spent the next week calling creditors with her, explaining that Dad had left and asking about payment plans while she cried quietly in the background. She managed to get her old job back but had to take extra night shifts while I watched my brother after school. We ate rice and beans for dinner every night because that's all we could afford, and I learned to make them taste different with whatever spices were left in the cupboard. My brother went back to his Tuesday and Thursday therapy sessions, and we set up a controlled music time each evening where he could use his keyboard with headphones for exactly 30 minutes. His meltdowns dropped from daily to maybe once a week, and he started using his rhythm cards to tell me when he felt scared or angry instead of just hitting himself. Meanwhile, Dad was live streaming himself playing guitar in empty coffee shops and blaming us online for destroying the family dream, but his followers started asking why he was alone, if this was really about bringing the family together through music. I went back to the school the next Monday and filled out the re-enrollment forms with shaking hands while the secretary kept asking if everything was okay at home. My teachers let me make up tests during lunch periods, but I kept falling asleep in class because I'd been up all night helping Mom calm my brother down when his routine got disrupted again. My chemistry teacher pulled me aside and said she understood family problems, but my grades were dropping from A's to C's, and colleges would see this semester on my transcript. I nodded and promised to try harder, but that night I had to skip homework again because my brother was hitting himself, and Mom couldn't handle it alone after working a double shift at the hospital. The CPS caseworker showed up for our first monthly visit and found me trying to teach my brother his rhythm cards while Mom was passed out on the couch from exhaustion. She helped us fill out forms for food stamps and connected us with a respite care worker who could watch my brother 3 afternoons a week so I could actually study sometimes. Mom told Dad he could only come back if he agreed to go to counseling and stopped planning any tours, but he just showed up whenever he wanted anyway. Some nights I'd find him sleeping in the van in our driveway, and other nights he'd be on the couch when I got up for school. He'd play guitar in the garage until 3 in the morning, and the neighbors started complaining about the noise. Mom was too tired to fight him about it and just started wearing earplugs to bed. The school music teacher convinced me to play in the spring recital, even though I told her I wasn't ready. I practiced the pieces I'd learned during my secret freshman year classes whenever my brother was at therapy. The night of the recital, Mom sat in the front row crying while I played Moonlight Sonata with only 2 mistakes. She kept whispering sorry between songs, but Dad never showed up, even though Mom had texted him about it 3 times. After the recital, people from the school started avoiding me because their parents had seen Dad's videos online calling us dream killers. Someone spray-painted child abusers on our mailbox, and Mom had to repaint it twice in 1 week. I deleted all my social media accounts after reading comments saying we deserved what happened for destroying Dad's music career. Mom picked up extra shifts at the hospital to pay for my brother's therapy, but the bills kept coming faster than she could earn. The electricity got shut off for 2 days until Mom borrowed money from her sister. I started looking at job applications, but Mom caught me and made me promise not to drop out. She said education was the only way we'd ever escape this cycle, but I knew my college scholarship dreams were basically dead with my grades tanking. My brother started using a card that said safe when he felt overwhelmed instead of hurting himself. The therapist taught him to hum quietly when he needed to calm down, and it actually worked most of the time. Every night before bed, I'd sit with him and we'd hum together for 10 minutes. Sometimes he'd match my pitch perfectly, and other times he'd create his own harmony that somehow made the melody better. It became our special thing that nobody else understood. Late at night, I'd hear Dad playing guitar in the driveway while I practiced piano scales in my room. The 2 sounds never matched up and just created this weird musical chaos that pretty much summed up our whole family now. We were all still living in the same house, but we'd become 3 separate units trying to survive instead of a family. Mom worked and slept and cried when she thought we couldn't hear. Dad drifted in and out like a ghost who couldn't decide if he wanted to haunt us or leave for good. My brother and I had our humming, but that was the only real connection left. The tour van still sat in the driveway with flat tires and peeling paint, like a monument to another one of my parents' extremes that fixed nothing and broke everything. Thanks for hanging out with me through all these questions and random wonderings. It's always cool exploring this stuff together. I'll see you next time. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.